What educators say is still lacking in schools 1 year after they walked out of the classroom and to the Capitol.
We are far from anything that looks like a finish line.
The importance of a counselor on campus.
They're certified educators with a background in mental health.
And looking into the millions raised in Arizona's U.S. Senate race.
Republicans want to defend that seat, and the Democrats want to take it away.
Hello and welcome to Arizona 360. I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thank you for joining us. This time last year, Arizona was seen red. The grassroots movement Red for Ed was front and center at the Capitol after tens of thousands of educators staged a walkout at schools that lasted several days. In the end, lawmakers approved pay raises amounting to 20% over 3 years. That includes a 5% raise in this year's budget. This week, we heard from Red for Ed supporters about ongoing challenges in the classroom. We begin with Jason Freed, president of the Tucson Education Association. Last year, you were here right about the same time, different conversation because 50,000 plus teachers were out of the classroom. What's the tune this time around, 1 year later?
So the tune really is cautious optimism. We have a state legislature that is now listening to educators and listening to the community. Education continues to be the #1 issue for Arizonans, but now the legislature and the governor are actually paying attention to those things. If you recall, a year ago, the governor was saying, all I have is 1% for raises for teachers. And now we're seeing significant raises, and most are doing a really good job at spreading that money, not just to teachers in the classroom, but teachers outside of the classroom as well as the support staff. And so we are in a different situation. What I would probably say is that cautious optimism says, okay, is the next piece going to happen? Is the next 5%? Is the next 5%? And does the governor and the state legislature think that somehow they've addressed the issue at this point? Because we're critically behind when it comes to education funding in Arizona.
One thing that we've continued to see this year are the signs, the T-shirts, the writing on car windows.
Absolutely.
Those same people were involved in the movement last year. What is the intention this time around?
So Red for Ed is still absolutely alive and well. Nobody has forgotten the struggle that exists in Arizona's schools and the realities that exist. And so at this point, any student in a public school in Arizona who is under the age of 16 has been in a system that's been underfunded and continues to be in a system that's underfunded. We're over $700 million behind where we were in 2008 funding levels. So when you look at that reality, although we did take a step further and step forward, we are far from anything that looks like a finish line.
You just laid out some of the concerns. How does the movement move forward and what's next?
So what's next is we continue to hold the governor and the state legislators' feet to the fire. And that's truly what has to be next. And when I say we, that's the Red for Ed community is not just teachers. It's teachers, it's classified staff, it's parents, it's community members, it's all Arizonans, because Arizona is saying loudly, we need to do better for our kids. And to be able to do so, we have to increase the funding. We are woefully underfunded when it comes to counseling. And we know, and we've seen all the ills that we're struggling in Arizona and as well as nationally. Counseling staff is absolutely paramount. Security, as much as we hate to admit the world that we live in, violence is part of this world, and so we need to be able to make sure that our kids are safe at school, and most schools have 1 or 2 monitors to keep 600, 800, 3,000 kids safe. And so when we look at those kinds of pieces, very few schools have a librarian at all. Some schools, libraries are essentially closed. Those realities are simply not acceptable for our kids, and so Red for Ed will continue to lobby at the state legislature, continue to lobby our community, and even as recently as this afternoon, there'll be a rally downtown, and we did this last year, and the support that we gained from the community was what lifted educators to know this is the right moment. And as we continue to have that support, it lets us know we are so far from the finish line, and Arizonans and our kids in particular deserve better.
Arizona 360 went to the rally that afternoon, where we heard from other educators about why they continue to demonstrate.
Red for Ed! A year ago we asked for 5 demands, and they met the teacher pay partially, but they haven't really provided the adequate funding we need for the schools.
Former student. There are many teachers who just don't want to do this anymore. We have teachers leaving the classroom. I mean, it's scary. They're not coming back next year.
I can't believe I have to stand up here and say that.
For 2 months into the school year, had 2 classrooms that didn't have teachers. There were days when we were forced to keep our kids in during lunch because there was nobody outside to be monitoring the playground during lunch.
This is my year when I graduate. I graduate in May, and I'm incredibly excited. The pay is second to teaching for me, but I think it's incredibly important to make sure that teachers and schools get the funding that they need.
I mean, nobody went into education thinking they were going to get rich, but we thought we'd be able to pay our rent and buy our groceries. I've been a counselor for almost 23 years. I have a little over 600 kids, and I'm the only one there. Earlier on in my career, I had time to go into the classroom and do preventative lessons.
Call your legislators, make our students their priority.
And I can't get into the classrooms anymore because I'm putting out fires all day long.
When I wear this t-shirt out in public, they all say, isn't it great, you know, how everything worked out? And things have not worked out. And so we're ending the school year, and we believe that we're going to come back to the same old next year. So we're here to remind people that we need support.
Red for Ed! Red for Ed!
The voices are going to get louder. We're going to be heard no matter what. It's just a matter of when.
Red for Ed! Red for Ed!
Education may not be the most dominant issue at the Arizona Capitol this year, but nonetheless, it's on the minds of politicians and lawmakers. We learn more from the Yellow Sheet editor, Hank Stevenson. Our conversation picks up with why it's unlikely the legislature will fund much beyond the 5% pay raise the state already promised teachers this year.
There's a lot of money to go around, but there's also a lot of money that's already been tied up. You know, 10% raises, 5% raises. They want some money for school counselors. They want money for the universities. They want money for other state employees. So really, in order to solve the education funding crisis, it's going to take a new revenue stream. And there are people talking about that, a lot of different people talking about a lot of different ways we could do that. But none of them are going to come through the legislature. It'll have to be a citizens' initiative on the 2020 ballot.
You just mentioned counselors, school safety, universities. How did they fare this legislative session?
So we still haven't gotten a budget out of the legislature yet. We haven't even seen any real movement on the budget. We're past 100 days of the legislative session, which is constitutionally when they're supposed to close up shop. They don't have to. They have until June 30th to pass a budget. But Ducey came out with his budget proposal, which is usually pretty close to what the legislature ends up passing at the end of the day. And he proposed a somewhat significant investment in both school resource officers, kind of campus cops, and counselors. So the legislature seems pretty willing to go along with those plans, and frankly, they're not really high dollar plans. I think it's a total of about $15 million between those two asks. The bigger issue will be if the legislature is willing to go along with his stop order, which is a severe threat protection order, which is essentially like a restraining order for people who are viewed as dangerous and shouldn't have guns. This was part of his school safety package. Last year, it's the reason his school safety package last year didn't pass. And it looks like it's not going to pass again. The Democrats say that it doesn't go far enough to be able to take people's guns away if they're viewed by certain like family members as a credible threat to themselves. And the Republicans think that's way too far.
Early on, there were some rumblings about a possible tax initiative coming up to fund education. Didn't seem to gain any traction, though.
Well, so last election cycle, there was an initiative put to the ballot. It got enough signatures to go to the ballot. That was the Invest in Ed initiative, and that was a tax hike, income tax hike on the highest earners in this state. That was tossed off the ballot by the Supreme Court, basically technicalities, and the education community has been kind of regrouping, figuring out, okay, do we go back with this exact same ask? Do we tweak it slightly? Like, where do we go from here? So they're very much planning on putting something to the ballot, probably a income tax hike for the wealthiest earners to pay for education. Separate from that, some lawmakers who really don't want to see income tax hikes are talking about expanding Proposition 301. It's a 20-year tax. It takes about a 0.6 of a penny on the dollar sales tax. They want to expand it to a full penny, which would bring in somewhere around $300 million for education. The state GOP chair, Kelly Ward, just came out in support of this idea yesterday, which was bizarre for a number of reasons. One, she's a very conservative Republican, and for her to support a tax increase that the governor doesn't support, is just kind of weird, leaving her hanging out there in the wind. Her base is not happy with this, and it doesn't look like it has the votes to pass at the legislature anyway.
One thing that was new this year, an educator who is the superintendent of public instruction, has Kathy Hoffman been the advocate that many of her supporters thought she would be?
Well, we're about 100 days and change into her tenure as superintendent of public instruction, so tough to say. Her big push at the beginning of this year was repealing the no promo homo law, which was a law that was put on the books back in the early 1990s amid kind of the AIDS scare that says, in the context of teaching sex education, specifically on AIDS, that you cannot promote a homosexual lifestyle. She was able to get lawmakers, even advocacy groups who would normally you would expect them to kind of be in support of these things, the Christian values advocacy groups. They all kind of threw up their hands and said, yeah, go ahead and repeal it. So that was her first big win. I think her office is kind of recouping from years of Diane Douglas as superintendent, who was notorious as a person who fired a lot of people, had a lot of people willingly leave that office because of her management style. Kathy Hoffman commissioned a report basically looking at where does the office stand, and they have a lot of work to do to just get that office to be a high-functioning office, and I think that's a lot of what she's focusing on right now.
All right, Hank, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
As we've been hearing, funding for more counselors is an issue at the forefront of discussions about how to improve K-12 schools in Arizona. For insight on the role counselors can play in a student's development, we turn to Leah Falco, a professor of counselor education at the University of Arizona.
School counselors are really an integral part of public education. They're certified educators with a background in mental health. All school counselors have to have a master's degree in the state of Arizona to become certified. So they really are well positioned in the school to be able to provide comprehensive, preventive, and responsive support services for students in three closely interconnected domains. So we talk about the academic domain, the career development domain, and also their social emotional development. So throughout their K-12 schooling, school counselors are able to provide a lot of assistance to students in those three areas.
One study that I read put Arizona toward the bottom, and is this correct? 800 students for one counselor. In some cases, there may not even be a counselor on a campus.
Correct. Unfortunately, in the state of Arizona, the most recent stats for the counselor to student ratio is now 1 to 900, and Arizona is the worst in the nation now regarding that ratio. So school counselors are really in the best position to respond to those basic needs, to be able to identify when students may be experiencing adversity and to respond accordingly.
Are there any data points that show here's a result of not having a counselor on campus and this has been the effect?
The research isn't clear that there's a direct relationship necessarily between having a school counselor and, say, reduced violence at school, which is becoming an increasing concern. However, the reverse is been borne out in the research. So if there isn't a school counselor at a school, then schools may be at greater risk for experiencing social distress among the students, increased levels of aggression, bullying, a reduced school climate, and things like that, outcomes like that.
Now, you work here at the University of Arizona. Part of it is teaching students to become counselors. Right. How do we fix this?
Well, one major point of education is advocacy, and we in the profession advocate for our profession and to make sure that those in the community first know what school counselors do. And that's number one, to make sure that everyone understands how important school counselors are. And then from there, we can advocate for having more school counselors present in the school. So when we think about the comprehensive programming that I mentioned earlier, that responds or that addresses both prevention and responsive services. So prevention in the form of skills development, education, mindfulness, those kinds of things, but also responsive to emergent needs of students. So when there are crises that occur, school counselors are the ones who do that. So if a school doesn't have a counselor, or if it has too few counselors, they simply can't do the work that they're trained to do.
Sounds like a very real part of the education platform.
I would agree wholeheartedly.
Okay. All right, Leah, thank you.
Thank you.
Some of them have the highest level of security clearances. Well, why are you not that?
Early fundraising totals are out for the candidates in what will be one of the most closely watched races in 2020. Democrat Mark Kelly and Republican Martha McSally were the only U.S. Senate candidates in Arizona to report donations to the Federal Election Commission website. Christopher Conover took a closer look at the numbers.
Mark Kelly raised a little more than $4 million in his first run for elected office. Martha McSally, a political veteran, put $2 million in the bank during the first quarter. Both candidates had their share of big dollar donors and small contributions. Kelly received donations of $25 or less from more than 150 people. McSally received those same-size donations from more than 500 people. Kelly pledged not to take corporate donations for his campaign, and it shows in his first fundraising report. He raised about $40,000 from 10 different political action committees. In comparison, McSally raised a little more than $500,000 from nearly 150 PACs. Both candidates received money from Arizona and the rest of the country. Kelly received 352 donations from the Tucson area. That was part of more than 900 he received from Arizona as a whole. The people of New York City gave him his second largest geographically grouped donations. For McSally, Tucson was also her largest donation area with 167 contributions. In all, 600 checks came into the McSally campaign from Arizona. Washington, D.C. donations accounted for her second largest geographic area of financial support.
Christopher joins me now with more about what those numbers tell us so far about the type of campaign each candidate is running. Christopher, thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
So let's begin. What does this mean moving forward?
What this means is there's a lot of interest in the race right now, especially on the Democratic side. Mark Kelly, who is not a politician. Yes, he has run a political group now known as Giffords, but he's not a politician. Raised more than $4 million in the first quarter of the year. That's a big number, and that means that Democrats are very interested in this race.
It's almost there.
This is his first race, but not so for Martha McSally. So take me back a bit, and what do the numbers look like then?
It's interesting. This, of course, is Martha McSally's second run for U.S. Senate. She ran in the last cycle. It seems so long ago, but it was just last year. For the seat that now Kyrsten Sinema holds. At this same point in the race, I went back and looked at how much money Martha McSally had raised, and she had raised $2.3 million for this same time period for that race, which is very similar to what she raised now. What's more interesting is Kyrsten Sinema, the Democratic who became the Democratic nominee and eventually won, had raised $500,000 at this same time in the race, compared to Mark Kelly's $4.2 million. We also should point out that both Sinema and McSally, for the previous race, had primaries, and so far we don't have U.S. Senate primaries. We're on to the general. Now we have time to go. Still, anybody could qualify. We could end up with a primary, but not at this point.
Who are some of the big names shelling out cash for this race?
The big names shelling out cash, interestingly, I looked at the PACs, the political action committees. We should note that Mark Kelly has said he will not take money from corporate PACs. Martha McSally didn't say that. She got PAC money from 148 different PACs in this quarter. The big names, interestingly for her, were American Airlines and Boeing were the two big givers on PACs in this quarter. Mark Kelly got money from 10 different PACs, not corporate PACs, more issue-oriented PACs, and McSally got her share of that type of money also. His big one was a group that showed up during the last cycle called 314 Action Fund, and they support candidates who are interested in sciences and things like that. So no surprise that they're going with Mark Kelly, who talks a lot about climate change, but was also an astronaut.
National interest in this Arizona Senate race, why do you suppose that is?
Very high because A, it is almost an open seat. Of course, Martha McSally is in it at the moment, but she was appointed to hold it. We have almost the second open seat in a row in Arizona. So there's a lot of interest there, and people think that they can get rid of Martha McSally. Democrats think she is vulnerable, and to pick up potentially for Democrats 2 Democratic Senate seats in Arizona, which is viewed as red, would be a big pickup. So the Republicans want to defend that seat, and the Democrats want to take it away.
Lots to come on TV, radio ads for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, Christopher Conover, thank you.
Thank you.
Candidates running for state office have access to public funds from the Citizens Clean Elections Commission. Those dollars come from a variety of sources to include court fees and funds that candidates raise from people, not committees. The commission is a voter-created board that has functioned independently from the governor or the legislature. It provides funding for qualified candidates and enforces campaign finance laws while also supporting voter education like last year's push to register more young voters. Commissioner Mark Kimball joined us to discuss the issues that have the board's attention ahead of next year's elections. You've been around since the late 90s. How have you measured success beyond just voter turnout, younger people? I mean, there are other avenues that you've looked at?
Yes, quite a bit has been done by Clean Elections to make funding sources more transparent. I wish we could do a lot more. There's still too much dark money involved in campaigns, but the Arizona legislature has put up some roadblocks to protect some information on the sources of dark money. So that is something that I think is frustrating. I think people ought to know where all the money that goes into campaigns, whether it's for candidates or issues, comes from. We should do more about that, but that's up to the legislature. I think it has given candidates a choice. You can go out and raise a lot of money from private donors, or you can raise a small amount of money to show that you're a viable candidate and then have your campaign funded by money from Clean Elections.
When you talk about dark money, what really constitutes that, and how exactly is it still filtering itself into campaigns?
Well, dark money is mostly money that you just don't know who donated it. And it often goes to groups that have very vague names, like Arizonans for Good Stuff or something, and you don't know what they're representing. And people can give money to that group and their identity can be shielded. And then that group can give money to another group, and you wouldn't know where that money came from. And ideally, we ought to be able to trace every dollar back to where it came from so that voters are educated about who is spending on candidates or on issues. We're not there yet. We're not there yet nationally, and we're not there in Arizona.
Aside from dark money, the commission is also concerned with the effects of Prop 306. Voters passed the initiative last November. It prohibits candidates from transferring public funds to political parties or groups, and it puts the commission's rulemaking under the authority of a council appointed by the governor. Kimball says some of the changes will need to be ironed out in court. What exactly did 306 mean? There were pros and cons to it for the future.
Well, 306, first of all, came up because Clean Elections allows some clean money to be given from candidates to political parties for certain services. voter lists, things like that. The people behind 306 didn't want that, didn't want any money to go to political organizations. But they also said that clean elections ought to fall under a group, the Governor's Regulatory Review Council, that is fully appointed by the governor. Instead of being an independent commission, it ought to answer to that. And this organization, the Governor's Council, ought to be able to look at clean election rules and say, no, we don't like these new rules that you're proposing to put in place, so we order you to stop. We don't know yet if that is in effect something that that council can do. So it's still being ironed out.
Any data that shows that taxpayers, voters are actually looking at campaigns differently in the last few years, just given so much more attention focused on politics?
Well, I'm not sure that I know of any data specifically to that point. Voters are always hungry for some unbiased source of information, and they're looking for facts, not just sound bites from politicians. And I think that's what we hope at Clean Elections we can focus on, is getting people to talk to voters more about the issues and not spending all the time in fundraising events, in house parties, in things like that. So I wish more candidates would run as clean candidates, but it's their choice. And if they don't run as a Clean Elections candidate, they can raise far more money. But they also have to spend a lot of time, a lot of money raising that money.
There's been a perception that whoever has the most money ultimately wins on Election Day. Are you saying that that's not always going to be the case, or it's likely that that could change as more people become interested in the system? Money
is certainly the grease that runs politics. But I would like to think that that is not going to be the major source. And there are instances where candidates that have raised less have won. Candidates that have run as Clean Elections candidates certainly are winning. So I guess the main message is we want people to have a choice. We want them to be able to make a choice between either running as a clean candidate or as a traditionally funded candidate.
Okay, Mark Kimball, thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all for now. Thanks for joining us. Share your feedback and visit us on social media. We'll see you next week.